So welcome everybody to the Celebrating Excellence in Aged Care webinar series, hosted by the Governance Evaluator. This webinar series is focused on supporting aged care providers to drive excellence in aged care under the new aged care standards. Today we're delighted to be joined by Megan Motto. Megan's the Chief Executive Officer of the Institute, the Governance Institute, and a big welcome to you, Megan, because I know you're quite new in this role and you have been travelling all over the countryside, so a big welcome to you.
Thanks, Faye.
We would also like to welcome Bruce Bailey, who's the Managing Director of Pride Living. Now, the Governance Institute has a membership of over 7,500, and the Governance Institute of Australia is the only fully independent professional association with a sole focus on supporting governance excellence through education, research, advocacy and support. And Bruce is the CEO and founder of Pride Living, and they're a management specialist for aged care industry, and they have an experienced team that assists aged care providers to maximise returns and returns for their residents and outcomes in aged care. So a very big welcome to you both. Bruce and Megan will share with us some great insights and tips that will help all aged care providers meet their governance challenges head on. So how we're going to run today is we're going to have 3 questions, and I'm actually going to ask both Megan and Bruce those questions, and they're both going to have about 5 minutes each answering those questions, which I think is going to be really interesting. And they're going to give us lots of tips and personal insights and professional insights as well. 3 questions are about what is governance in the aged care sector? How do the new aged care standards contribute to excellence in aged care? And why is board culture so important in achieving excellence in aged care? So let's get started. So Megan, could we start with you? And could we have an explanation of what governance means in the aged care setting and what it means to be a member of an aged care services board?
Thanks, Faye, and thanks for having me here. Now, that's actually a really fantastic question because there is so much conversation about governance at the moment in the community with the Hayne Royal Commission and everything else that's happening. You see ASIC in the news again today. But in its simplest forms, governance is a framework, if you like, for the setting a set of rules and norms that it takes to run an organisation. So I often like to say the strategic plan of the organisation might be like the design of a house, but the governance is the scaffolding that you put up to build that house, to make sure it's the plans that go into developing the house, it's the rules to make sure that it's sound, that it's going to perform according to what you want. It's going to enable you to both comply with the law, but also to perform really well as a business. And there's those 2 critical elements are really important in the conversation around governance, because oftentimes we think of governance as all about compliance, whereas governance is really critically about compliance and about performance. Now, there are obviously 2 elements to that. Once again, there is the external elements and internal elements, and just to explain those. So all organisations in Australia are regulated in the Australian context, whether that's through ASIC or the ACNC or any other regulators, whether it's ACCC or the ASX if you're a listed company. And so all companies in Australia of any nature are somehow regulated by an external force or forces, the ATO being another obvious one. In addition though, and so governance is definitely about making sure that you comply with those regulations which govern you as an organisation that you have to adhere to in order to have the licence to operate in our society. In addition though, there's internal forces, and that is the way that you decide to run yourself as an organisation internally. What committees do you want your board to have? What locations do you want to operate from? How will your board meetings run? How will people be elected to your board? How will they be removed from your board? So a lot of those internal rules are normally set up by your own company constitution. and they would help you govern yourself internally. So there's external elements and there's internal elements. Now, the vehicle with which we orchestrate all of this is usually a board of directors, and they might be called something slightly different, but a board of directors at the end of the day is the governing body that is tasked with implementing all of these rules and norms and establishing them and making sure that they're then carried out in the organisation. And once again, the board has both a role in the performance of the organisation, but also obviously are responsible ultimately for that compliance. And generally speaking, the responsibilities of a board are actually quite simple. We can get very overwhelmed with complexity, and there are lots of elements of this, but ultimately the board has three really big responsibilities. The first is to monitor the performance of the company to make sure that the company is adhering to those rules, that they are compliant with regulation, that they are operating in accordance with their own constitution and rules and norms. They are responsible for making sure that the company is solvent, that is, that you are able to pay your creditors when and as and when those invoices become due, so that you have to make sure that you're solvent. And I could do a whole nother seminar on insolvency and what goes on in those circumstances. And the third is the selection and monitoring of the CEO and or some monitoring element of the executive staff, but primarily it's the CEO who the board are responsible for selecting and monitoring the performance. Now, in particular with insolvency, there are extraordinarily heavy penalties for example, operating insolvently. But as we've seen, there's also, through the Hayne Royal Commission, there's also, and we of course have a Royal Commission into this sector as well going on at the moment, there are responsibilities that you must adhere to, and there are penalties for not adhering to those. And I think the one message that it's really important for everyone in the sector to understand is those penalties, both the responsibilities but also the penalties, the legal liabilities. There's two things that are really important here. Those legal liabilities go down to individual directors. So the company, there are some things that the company as limited by guarantee can wear in terms of a personal liability, but individually as a director, you also have a personal liability, and many of those personal liabilities cannot be contracted out of in terms of the law. So it's really important if you're sitting on a board that you understand what liabilities you personally have as a director that you can't say are covered by the corporate veil. And that's the first thing. The second thing that it's really important to understand is those responsibilities and liabilities, and indeed the financial penalties, are exactly the same if it's a not-for-profit or if it's a massive ASX listed corporate like BHP Billiton or Woodside Petroleum or any of the other big global giant, Woolworths, Telstra. Your responsibilities and liabilities as a director are exactly the same. So it's really, really important that if you are asked to be on a board of a local aged care health services organisation, that you really understand those things. And it's not to scare anyone. It's not terribly scary. If you're operating with due diligence, then you're going to, by and large, be okay. But ignorance is no defence in a court of law. If you are found to be wanting in any of those areas responsibility and you're brought in front of ASIC or anyone else for that matter in the front of the courts, you can't say, I didn't know and therefore I'm that is not an excuse in the eyes of the laws, and people really need to know what they're up against. So that's not to scare anyone too much, but that's the general framework.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Megan, so much. So, Bruce, I just wanted to turn to you and ask you, in all your experience of working with boards in aged care services, what are some of the common issues you have observed that arise from boards having an incomplete understanding of their roles and responsibilities? So Megan's just given us a good overview of that. Tell us about some of the things you've actually seen that have arisen in your work with boards.
Thanks a lot, Bea, and thanks, Megan, for your overview. I guess what I've seen is people doing exactly what Megan said they should do, people doing exactly the opposite. Let's flesh that out a bit more, for today I thought I'd just pick up on three themes. Megan talked about how directors are there to review, and I think the first thing that comes to mind is with lots of people on boards, they tend to forget the difference between review and do. And so what we see is that boards get too intimately involved in operations, so they're no longer reviewing, but in fact they're doing, or if not doing, they're delegating and instructing, and that's not the role of the board. What we can put a term around that, and we can call it, if you like, shadow management. So you end up with a CEO who's charged with doing something in the company, and then you get some or all of the board members starting to get involved in saying to the CEO, well, I think you should be doing this. I think you should be doing that, which is immediately disempowering for the CEO, but it's also putting the board into a role that they're really not necessarily competent at, and certainly that's not their role as boards. Similar, but a bit to the side of that, and I think the first problem about becoming shadow management can arise from what I call poor delegations. So boards, so that CEOs and other people in an organisation know what they should do, the board needs to have very clear delegations of what management is in control of and what matters are reserved for the board. Now, often you'll get a level of this happening, but it tends to vary from comprehensive to vague. And where it's vague, you get two things happen. Either the CEO keeps bringing back to the board lots of things for decision because they're not sure of what their responsibility is, which is actually dragging the board into that shadow management role. Or alternatively, the board is just putting itself into the position too much and doing the same thing. Now, for example, I had a client, or I was told of a client where a situation where the chairman and another member of the board met with the CEO every week to talk about what was happening in the organisation. And then they also approved every payment that went out from the organisation. So there's no effective delegation in that role. And you can imagine how the CEO feels in terms of, well, I'm not really here to do the job I've been asked to do. And the third one, and I had this conversation with a client last week. I was out visiting a provider. It's a single site provider and has a board. So it's in a large regional town. So it has a board of community representatives, mostly successful business people within their own right. And we were sitting around at the board table and talking about the performance of the organisation across various domains. And I got to a point and I said, it's really strange to me that you're all successful business people in your own right. And I know that you wouldn't tolerate in your own businesses the sorts of things that you're tolerating here. So I think the third thing I see with boards is too much tolerance for things that are happening other than the way they should be happening. So that might be in poor financial performance, it might be in poor management of staff, it might be in poor communications, it might be in poor compliance. So all of those issues within the aged care context. So for me, three good themes, I think, of things that I see that happen that shouldn't happen are shadow management, poor delegation, and excessive tolerance. And then if you like, take the flip side of that, you have the good boards, the ones that don't allow themselves to become shadow management. So they make sure they know what the CEO is doing, and the chairman makes sure that the rest of his directors don't have too much access to telling people what to do, certainly access to see what's happening. You have very clear delegation so everyone knows what's happening, and that helps reporting back to the board. And then you also have a call to action and a call to accountability. So there's three positives and negatives, I see.
Really good. Thank you so much, Bruce. So Megan, back to you. And let's now turn to those fabulous aged care standards, the new quality aged care standards. And what I'd like to ask you is, these really do contribute to excellence. And I'd like you to, if you could, give a bit of a summary of how you see these aged care standards contributing to excellence in aged care moving forward.
Fantastic. Thanks again. And I think that the primary guide, and well, the primary focus of the aged care standards sort of start and stop with customer service. And once again, this is a really interesting concept, and it's a concept that has shifted significantly in the last couple of years, and I think will continue to shift as we see Royal Commissions looking into the way that our major institutions deal with their stakeholders and customers. So it is a really big conversation happening in the governance landscape at the moment. We know that in the corporate sector, for example, through the Hayne Royal Commission, there is a focus on customer-centric services in a way that we've never seen before. And in fact, it's quite at odds with the way that we've traditionally seen organisations where they had a thing that we call shareholder primacy. That is, that organisations' sole purpose is to make money for their shareholders. Now what we're seeing is organisations that are regulated and regulators and political impetus in Australia also saying, no, you have a responsibility not just to your shareholders but to stakeholders. And even there's conversation around whether organisations have broader responsibilities to communities at large. So there's that conversation happening as well. And just to bring that back for the aged care standards, the standards actually start and stop. They're bookended with this concept of customer service and putting your customers at the centre of what you do. And once again, this goes back to one of the great things that, or the great quotes that have come out of the Hayne Royal Commission. And sorry to harp on the Hayne Royal Commission so often, but it is very relevant in these circumstances. And that is it's not just about what a board should do, can do, it's about what a board should do, thinking about the customers and the consequential elements of anything that they deliberate in the boardroom. So the standards definitely talk about consumer outcomes, about asking yourself some key questions when you're sitting on the board of an aged care services organisation. I'm confident that the organisation is well done, thinking about that from your customer's perspective, not just the internal perspective. So I think increasingly it's going to be very important to have feedback loops, whether they be through engagement surveys, customer surveys, looking at your statistics and looking at your data with regards to recording of critical incidents, response times, immediacy of service, for an aged care services sector, staff turnover, staff engagement, looking at some of those key metrics are going to be key to make sure that the alignment of those customer goals are cascaded down through your organisation. So the board sets the standards, the executive and the senior management staff, as Bruce has so absolutely adequately put, are the ones who are tasked with the doing and the implementing of those standards, but the feedback loops can only come when you actually talk to customers direct. So I would say to you, the aged care standards are a great framework for understanding those responsibilities and definitely highlight them in a really clear and concise way.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Megan. And Bruce, you're out there working in the field, and what I'd love to know is, have you got some examples of some of the areas that you've been working where the standards are contributing to excellence in aged care? If you could talk about some of those for us, give us some tips.
Well, I think at this stage, we're talking about the new standards. Everyone's absolutely focused on getting ready for July 1, which is now 3 days away. And I'm sure if we had visuals of all these people that are listening to this, we'd get lots of nodding heads saying, we're not quite there yet. So the reality is that people are working around compliance at the moment rather than being focused on delivery. That's the general thing. But I think you go behind that, and just to follow on from what Megan said, is the issue now is bringing the customer, however you want to term them, and we've got lots of terms for them in aged care, and still trying to figure out who they are, is bringing the customer to the front. And so what I'm seeing or encouraging with boards that I'm dealing with is boards need to understand what's happening within the organisations, and it brings that real risk of the issues I just talked about. there's a acronym in director circles called NIFO, noses in, fingers out, and I think that's the thing for everyone to remember. I sit on the board of a large provider, and we had a situation we wanted to check on employee engagement, so the directors all were tasked to go to various meetings. So we talked with the staff, but it was very important when someone says, oh, I've got this problem, if they see a director there and think, oh, I'll talk to him, this will get an answer. And so my response is, have you spoken with CEO? She's a really great person, will really listen, and she can actually solve your problem. I can't because I don't have any authority. And so I think that's an example. We want directors within organisations visible so that they can see what's happening and hear what's happening and then be aware of it. I think the other really big issue is boards seeing compliments and complaints. And I noticed there was some talk coming out of the Banking Royal Commission that you can say, okay, well, a certain percentage of people will always be unhappy, and so long as it doesn't breach the margin, then everything's okay. But the expectation now is, I think, that we have to focus on the outliers. And that's always been the case. But our natural instinct is to go to the reaffirming stuff, so that if we get a resident satisfaction survey of 84%, we think, beauty, we've got 84% happy. But then you really should be saying, is 16% unhappy acceptable in the context of what we're doing? Yes. So the key message is to focus on the, certainly get the reaffirming positives, but focus on the outliers. So I think that's the key. I think another thing, and this is a warning. The new standards are the Aged Care Act compliance requirements. They're rights of entry into aged care. They're just stuff, it's housekeeping stuff that has to be done. But it is not the end of the governance question for the boards. The boards have got to look outside of their compliance, because that's only one customer. That's the government, it's the Department of Health, it's the Commission, right? And they're not the people that are actually receiving the services and that we need to keep happy. We can have a wonderful compliant environment that doesn't of itself guarantee the best life for the people that are either living at home receiving services or living in a residential setting and receiving services. So I think balance is going to be a critical thing. And at the moment, the balance is naturally towards getting over the line, because there's a critical date. But then people will evolve in this and say, well, if we're doing what is good for any corporate organisation, then we will be fulfilling what we need to fulfil here. So I think there's a couple of examples. Is that enough? Would you like some more?
That's fantastic. Thank you. That's terrific. And the final area that we're going to talk about, and I want to ask you both about, is board culture. And the importance of the board's culture in achieving excellence in aged care, according to the new standards, is absolutely crucial. And Megan, what I'd love you to do is to explain about the importance of board culture in achieving the new standards, but as Bruce has just said, not just achieving the standards, but achieving greatness. So I'd love you to sort of talk a little bit about that, particularly in light of what the Governance Institute does and its culture data. I'd love to hear something about that as well.
Yes. Well, the Governance Institute haven't got necessarily data on culture, but we do a lot of work on ethics, and we produce an ethics index across the country, and we de-aggregate that through different sectors. What that tells us is that there is an ethics deficit. We think ethics is really important, and we don't think that we are as ethical as we should be, which is a really interesting thing, because most people in society, if you say to an individual, are you ethical? Try that one in your performance, in your recruitment process. Are you an ethical person? Of course, the answer is going to be yes. Everyone thinks they're ethical, but the core of ethics is, what you do when no one is looking, and that is the key. And that comes to the core of culture, because culture is the way things are done around here. There's lots of explanations for what is culture. Culture is, you know, the way that things get done around here, the way that things normally happen. And I want to just talk a little bit about how culture is developed in the first place, because it goes to the question of how to understand it and measure it. So in all organisations, there are forces at play, and generally speaking, in an organisation, there are external forces and internal forces. And then at the same time, there are formal processes and informal processes. So you've got formal, external might be things like your AGM, your annual report, the regulator, a regulator report, the standards, the aged care standards. So they will be external things, the stakeholder remarks that come through an AGM, etc. Then you've got your external informal mechanisms, your informal and internal mechanisms, which are your policies and procedures and whatnot. But culture is really built around what happens in an organisation that's internal, that happens inside, and it's the informal stuff. That is the stuff of where culture is made.
Yep.
So not your formal rules and procedures, it's what actually happens. Because I've seen organisations with policies and procedures up to the razoo, but of course people don't follow them because they're either cumbersome, or they don't think they're important, or for a range of different reasons, people won't follow them. So it's what actually gets done, not what you think gets done as a board. And the reason that's a really important thing to understand that differentiation is because often boards look for formal metrics to measure culture. Well, often boards haven't looked at measuring culture at all in the past. And what we now know is that boards are responsible for culture. Once again, Commissioner Hayne very, very clearly said the tone is set at the top, and boards need to be then thinking about how do you do that while still applying to the FIFO rule that Bruce mentioned, which is noses in, fingers out, because the board wants to purview, not do. So given that culture is developed in these informal mechanisms, how can the board feel that they've got a finger on culture without getting into micromanagement in an organisation? And this is really the question that's troubling a lot of boards at the moment, because they want to adhere to their responsibilities of making sure that culture in an organisation is conducive to good performance and great customer outcomes, but they also don't want to get into micromanagement and territory that is not the purview of the board. So the first thing that the board needs to do is to understand what their culture is, but also to understand what culture it is that you're trying to create in this organisation. What are the key values in the organisation? How do we establish those values in the organisations? How do we establish systems and processes where we live and breathe those values and that culture that we're trying to create? And then how do we communicate that to our staff and our customers and our external stakeholders beyond our customers? Because it might be the families of the people who have people in your care. So it might be, you know, quite a broad network of how you communicate that. Because it's only when there's clarity and alignment of communication that you know what you're measuring against in the first place. Yeah. So you need to have really clear, you know, what are the values that you're living and breathing by? What is the culture that you're trying to establish? And how is that communicated? And the second thing, of course, that boards absolutely need to do is then they need to start measuring themselves against those frameworks that they set. And here, really, a board is looking for two key things. There definitely you need to be thinking about key metrics that you should be asking to come up from your executive management. Metrics might include things like staff turnover, issues of incidences of non-compliance, critical incident responses, response times, feedback through engagement surveys of staff, feedback through surveys of your customers and clients. Now, the thing that you have to note here is that no one metric is adequate. And the reason no one metric is adequate is you have to be, in fact, quite aware of what can happen in surveys, and that is if you've got a poor culture, people won't tell you the truth in surveys. So you might have a bullying culture, you might have a culture of suppression of the truth, of silence, And in those circumstances, no one's going to tell you what's really going on in a survey because the culture is so bad that they will dampen the survey results. So yes, you get feedback. The key thing about those metrics, about surveys and other metrics, is it's the putting together of them. You have to think about them as a whole rather than any one metric giving you the answer. And you also have to put those together with your observations. So you do have to get out, talk to staff, meet your clients, meet the customers, walk the floors, do all of those things. And it's the combination of that information, clues and signals that you then need to make a discerning value judgment call about as to whether you think the culture that you wanted is actually the one that you've got.
Fantastic. That's wonderful. Thank you so much. And Bruce, what about you? In all your work with the boards and the organisations you've been working with, what are some examples of what they can do for leading good culture? Give me some ideas on some of the things you've seen that have actually helped.
Okay. When I saw this question, it took me back many years to a situation, many years. I was scratching there because then I had hair in the years that I went through. But I had someone, he was a consultant, and we were both talking with a client, and the client had been going on. So this was an owner of a business, was going on about the problem he had with morale in his organisation. And we left and we were in the car driving back, and the consultant said to me, I know where the problem was, we were sitting with it. So if there's a problem within the organisation, it comes from the top, because the next thing he said to me, he said, Bruce, enthusiasm trickles down from the top, it doesn't bubble up from the bottom. So that's why the board is so critical in all of this, that the tone at the top sets the tone throughout the organisation. And so, Megan, you were going on lots of different examples of how that plays out. And I think that's the first thing, is that you've got to have engaged board members. And in the aged care sector, one of the problems is, or one of the challenges, is that 60% of the sector is in the not-for-profit space. And so you tend to get a lot of volunteer boards. And I tell the story occasionally that, some people retire, they get bored at home, so then they go and get a seat on the board. So they're now board. And that's the problem. You've got to have people on the boards who really have a sense of love and ownership for what they're doing. But they've also got to have the skills that are necessary to do that. So I think that's the first thing, is keep people on the board who are enthusiastic. And just because people are not remunerated does not mean that they're not accountable to perform to a certain standard. The external accountability Megan's spoken about, but the chair of a board needs to make sure that the board members understand that they're accountable to achieve a certain level of performance. So I think that's the first thing. I think the next thing, and this comes about a lot, you get people on boards for all sorts of different reasons. You want people that are connected into the community. You want people that can help raise funds. You want people that have got experience in business or property. All of those things come in. But at the end of the day, you have to have people who understand the industry, the dynamics, the changes, the challenges, all of that. The board that I sit on had a big renewal, and within that we had people who didn't have a lot of experience in the sector. They had a lot of great skills for the board. But we've actually got to a point now we're saying, and I say this to all the boards I speak to, I think it should almost be mandatory, if you're on the board of an aged care operator, that you, on a rotational basis, attend conferences. That's where you hear what's going on. You get the whole broad spectrum. It's where you meet potential new CEOs when you go through the process of wanting to appoint someone, because you'll talk to them. Lots of things that come out of it. My fellow board members did this last year, and they came away just so enthusiastic about what they'd learned. And, you can't say I can't afford it. It's got to be a priority and funded. You're not paying these people to do this, so you can at least help them with continuing professional education. So that's another thing. I think you've got to know the industry. You've then got to go, know and understand the organisation. But the framework of being knowledgeable about the sector is really helpful for then seeing what's happening in the organisation. A thing, and I'll go back to strategic planning because that takes us right back to the start. So I loved your analogy about the scaffolding and the plans, Megan. And the builder is the other piece in it. So the board, if they're the scaffolding, they're certainly not the builders. They're not holding the hammers. So we know that, and that's good to remember. Often we do a lot of strategic planning work with boards, and sometimes the question, well, my first question is the board creating the strategic plan, or is the board setting a context within which management's going to create the strategic plan? And unfortunately, some boards are saying, oh no, we do the strategic planning. Now, I'm not here to say what's right and wrong, but if you're reviewing and you're scaffolding, then you're not the plan. And so giving context as to, what does our constitution say, what's our vision and mission, and then talking about where does that mean. And again, because you've been out and you know the sector, what's the impact of the changing dynamics between home care and resi care? What's the impact on the changing length of tenure? How does that relate to what we're doing? I was working with a board recently and they were putting in an early childhood learning centre, and then someone said, well, as a mother with primary care responsibility for the children, they get 12 weeks holidays a year and I get 4. So there's 8 weeks that are a problem to me. And if there was an early childhood centre here and we put in holiday programs, that would make us a really attractive employer for people like me. Great idea. And it also brings in multi-generational connection between people who are in care. So there's a lot of great things that this organisation was able to say, this fits well with what we're trying to do. So thinking a bit outside. So that was good. And that was coming up as input from an employee, not directed down from the board, because I would never have thought of that. Our kids were all grown up. So I think that in strategic planning, my big thing is about board setting tone, context, and when we work with board, that's what we do. We come up with an output from that session, and then we actually give it back to the management team and say, well, here you go, here's all the thinking, time for you to now put it into a plan. So again, they own it. So ownership is key to getting performance and accountability. And the other obvious is know the organisation. I think tenure on board's a really big thing. Making sure it's not a club and it can't renew itself. Making sure that there is turnover and again, diversity. And there's nothing wrong with having a 30-something-year-old on the board. They'll have lots of questions that they're not afraid to ask, so that's good. Which questions remind me, Megan, you were talking about the surveys. I think this is a thing that we all underplay. Any survey has bias in it. And you'll get a great result because all the enthusiastic people will participate and all the disenchanted won't. So you'll think, oh, we're doing really well, which happened again in another setting. These people said, oh, we've got 64% of our staff are engaged, and the benchmark is 75% or whatever the number was for the sector. So we've got a bit of work to do, but we're going okay. And I thought, shock, horror, 48% of the people running around the place hate being there. How big a risk is that? So, yeah.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Bruce. That's so helpful. And Bruce and Megan, thank you so much. I'm going to bring our session to an end now. And just quickly, I was just going to put up 3 key take-home messages from today, which is that today more than ever, providers need to focus on strong governance and high performance. And how the cornerstones on which this is built are integrated governance framework and a sustainable business model. And last but not least is that really important thing, which is the importance of board culture. And really listening to Megan and Bruce, I want to thank you so much because I think you've explained that really, really well. And I love that notion of it being all about being consumer-centric. And I guess it's all about the board actually role modelling that and getting themselves right into that as well. So we want you to extend your knowledge. I mean, the whole idea of these webinars is for, yes, we want to listen to some really amazing talks, but the whole idea is to extend your knowledge. So we want people to download the resources. We've actually got some fantastic resources. Megan's given us Adding Value to Governance in Aged Care, and this is a fantastic resource by the Governance Institute. And Bruce, thank you very much. You've given us a good governance checklist, so they'll be available because everybody who's come to or registered for this webinar is actually going to receive an email after this with all of these things in it. And I want to strongly recommend to everybody that they do actually reach out and connect with our experts today. And we have contact details here for Bruce at Pride Living, and also our contact details for the Governance Institute of Australia, and of course our contact details for the Governance Evaluator. And I know that after today people will be wanting to reach out, which will be really important. And for us, we're doing this series to support and work with all of those amazing people who do work in aged care. And we'd love your feedback. We'd love you to get in touch with us and tell us how you thought of today's series, because at the end of the day, it is based on what you're all telling us you want. So finally, I really want to thank you, Megan and Bruce. Megan, I can't believe you're the most amazing person. You've actually, as I say, everybody, you've just started in this new CEO role and have literally got in and out of planes, and really thank you so much for being available for our talk today. And Bruce, thank you so much. I know you're actually not out on a bike at the moment, but a lot of the time you're out bike riding, you travel all around Australia as well with your incredible work. And last but not least, I just want to thank the enormous amount of people from all over Australia who've tuned into this webinar today. We sincerely want to thank you, and we really enjoy working with you, and we look forward to continuing the series in the future.